bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary Holy Land from the heathen. I'm Matt Pegas, and I'm here with Dan Baltic.
It's Dan Baltic.
And today we have an episode titled The Manosphere to Literature Pipeline, and we're going to be discussing the blog of Chateau Heartiste, famous, perhaps infamous Manosphere blogger. His blog ran, I wish I had the exact dates in front of me, but somewhere in the realm of 2008 to... the prime was about 2008 to 2012, and it persisted for years afterward. I think it was maybe taken down in 2018, 2019, after it got more controversial, which we'll get into. But we read the blog via a book that we bought from Amazon called Heartiste on Game, which pretty much
a mere 400 pages long.
A mere 420-page compendium of the best of Heartiste, the stuff on which he cut his teeth, pickup advice, basically, but also a broader philosophical vision of men and women and society, which had much further reaching implications. And I think that's kind of our theme for the day, is what those further implications ended up being, the various pipelines extending from the Manosphere.
So yeah, it's the Manosphere. I mean, Heartiste is probably, in my opinion, the best writer among those who, among those who wrote about game. It's not a very, deep roster of excellent writers. I mean, there are a lot of writers emerged from that who were very good. But among those who are actually writing seduction techniques, Heartiste is kind of like the Da Vinci or the Hemingway of writing about game and seduction. And so that's why we chose Heartiste to examine Manosphere foundations and what it eventually became. But I think it's important for us to drill down on what the Manosphere was and what, how it started and where it went. Mm-hmm. And Heartiste is a part of that, but it's something. I'll just explain. So in the late 2000s, 2006, 2007, into the 2010s, there. A lot of you probably already know this, but there's a lot of literature out there from the pickup artist community telling men how to pick up women in bars and on the street and such, and breaking it down with a sort of scientific precision and applying indeed human biology and stuff actual, at that time and still controversial scientific application of biology to human nature. And it took off because men need to get laid, and it was useful. And that then grew into other stuff. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, my impression with pickup artistry, so to speak, is that it started 80s, 90s in sort of the realm of... some of it was probably true, so this isn't to necessarily denigrate it, but it started in the realm of people who would hold conferences. It still is somewhat the realm of people who hold conferences in Las Vegas and such, and sort of pay-per-view TV and almost infomercial, order my 20-part tape series self-help world. My impression is it's sort of emerged as
True,
an
true.
edgier aspect of that, encapsulated perhaps best of all on film by Tom Cruise in the Paul Thomas Anderson movie Magnolia, which is highly recommended. But
Absolutely.
basically, my impression is that it started in that world, and then around about 2003, 2004, Neil Strauss wrote his book, The Game, which is kind of a work of gonzo journalism more so than a game, almanac in its own right. But nevertheless, that kind of helped it find a larger audience. And then also with the advent of the quote-unquote blogosphere, the manosphere was soon to follow. And so by 2007, 2008, you're getting blogs like Chateau Heartiste, which are taking the basic game advice from the older, you pick a PUA 1.0, shall we call it, and beginning to turn it into much more of it, at least in Chateau Heartiste's case, or Royce in DC. It's, however you want. The protagonist of this blog, he goes by both names. But people mostly call him Heartiste now, so I think that's what we'll do on this podcast. Anyhow, he definitely started to elevate it to an art, both in terms of having the best pickup advice, but also touching on these, manosphere pipeline to other things, be them political or literary, which I think we'll get into now. He kind of was the ground zero for taking what started as a, something edgy, but in the family of self-help, and moving it towards, a certain lifestyle advice, but more than that, a way of being in the world as a man, in a way that you can see the pipeline from him to our current exemplars like Cernovich and Jack Murphy, and even people like BAP. They're all about this discussion of how to be in the world as a man and as an alpha. And of course, once you get into that,
essentially a manosphere to politics pipeline, in a sense.
Manosphere to politics pipeline that's somewhat well documented. It's always known that the quote unquote red pill community, whether or not the term red pill came from the manosphere or the dissident right, I'm not even sure if that's a known quantity, but basically the connection between those two things is pretty well understood. And again, I would posit that this is the reason, that it has to do with being in the world as a man, which begins as a pickup artistry consideration.
Absolutely.
And ends politically. But we also want to talk about the manosphere to literature pipeline is our more solid focus here.
Yeah, although before we get into that, there are many, offshoots of the manosphere to politics pipeline, one of which was followed by Heartiste himself, which was
yeah. I mean, you have, we'll just start off lightly. You have people like Cernovich and Jack Murphy, and even BAP I would actually put in this category, where it's a manosphere to politics pipeline, and you get a temperate, not necessarily, I won't even say temperate, but, just a pro-male politics, whether that means you're a Republican or a Baptist. All of this is in the realm of relative respectability to us. However, Heartiste is a bit more infamous.
Heartiste kind of traveled the manosphere to white nationalism pipeline, and it obviously we're focusing on this podcast on Heartiste, and he's an amazing writer and has amazing insights into men and women and to being a man in the world. It does not mean that we advocate his eventual turn toward more extremist politics, which is something that we disavow.
Of course we disavow. No, I don't even mean that sarcastically. We do disavow, and I haven't read much of... I haven't really come across... Perhaps thankfully haven't really come across much of his more extreme Wignat, so to speak. Or maybe I won't even use that word, but his more extreme turn, which goes beyond just WN, I think, and it's... People call him like a anti-Semitic maniac. I haven't come across much of it. Not that interested.
It was
even
pulled down from WordPress.
Yeah.
The reason why you can't come across this stuff is a lot of this stuff, political stuff, was pulled down. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of ways to feel about that, obviously. That, I think we're kind of united in the sentiment that big corporations should not censor speech. and even if we don't like that speech. So
right,
that was
no,
not great.
we're united in that sentiment. But again, I haven't come across much of what Heartiste actually said. But all I do know is that Delicious Tacos, who is very pro, free expression and willing to say controversial things himself, nevertheless, pretty much feels the need to sow this disavowal any time Heartiste comes up. So that tells me something that it really is quite bad. But that's not what we're focusing on today, perhaps, thankfully.
Yeah, I
But
found, and this is
maybe,
just a side
yeah.
note, I don't know if we keep it in, but I found that Delicious Tacos is generally a good thermometer for like what is like based but not radioactive. And like
No,
if you're
I'm
on
willing to keep
board
that
with
in. Yeah.
DT, like I think he's like he's a really, like real, like I don't know him, but he seems like a really like good guy.
Yeah, no, I think so. I've talked to him once, and I'm sure that he'll be coming on this podcast. We just got to get him in. But no, I basically agree with that sentiment. But even though I don't want to focus on Heartiste's, extremism, maybe it's worth unpacking just a little bit further. What the origin of that is, and I think it has to do with what we talked about regarding the quote unquote red pill last episode, which is that PUA, like certain racialist ways of looking at the world and looking at politics, is indeed, it's founded on a basic sense of biological determinism, which I think that you and I agree, and most of our listeners will agree, is valuable to look at things from a biological deterministic, perhaps even evolutionary psychology type of framework. But it can be overdone to the point of overly reducing certain realities. And I think Heartiste does that a little bit with regard to women in game, but ostensibly a lot more does he reduce to the point of stupidity with politics.
Yeah, I think drilling down into the red pill, like why is it valuable, and the reason why it was valuable for Heartiste, and for is the same reason why it's valuable for Cernovic in politics, and tacos in literature, and I don't know, Rushvi as a religious figure
Yeah,
is
Western Rasputin or whatever he is now.
is because it allows you to see the world without rose-colored glasses, or whatever you want to call it, to see the actual truth, which is just really plain for anyone to see if they want to see it. But if you live in a world where everyone denies that truth, then you're at a great advantage if you're like actually able to say like, okay, this is the difference between X and Y,
Mm-hmm.
and that you understand that gives you an edge. Information gives you an edge. And so, like, to just drill down on a specific example, the writing of Delicious Tacos. And I guess I'm starting to sound like a tacos fanboy.
That's
I
okay.
got to stop simping here. But
He's a good example of what we're talking about a lot of the time. So,
yeah,
yeah.
his writing, the reason why it really, well, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why it's good is because he's red pilled and
Yeah.
he's telling the truth, and people want to hear the truth. The truth is fun to hear. It confirms your view of reality, which people like. They like to know that other people see the same thing that they do. And in a world where no one actually endorses, or where the official storyline and the official narrative is not the truth, then if you're a writer willing to tell the truth, I mean, that's a huge edge. And so,
Absolutely. I mean, that's the basis of what all art and maybe most literally writing, but it can be done in painting and certainly in film as well. Is pinching out the truth and the truth as it is most clearly understood, which is rarely, the official narrative, rarely just day to day talk. It's just locating locating those elements of truth that are sometimes not okay to say, but if you can say the truth as honestly and clearly as you can, that is the root of all great art, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And I should also add, with regard to the Manosphere and even with regard to pickup and tacos, I don't know if he would ever necessarily been called a pickup artist, but definitely his original blogging overlapped with that.
It was on Rushvi's forum, I think.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, his own delicious.tacos.com has been around a while. But yeah, no, he's associated with that and knows that, is aware that he's associated with that. But there is a libidinal element to it, too, that I kind of found in prep for this episode. I sort of keep a diary sometimes, and I find that when I'm writing about women that I see, even in ways that are, quote-unquote douchey, if you're, judging the way they look, rating them on a scale of 1 to 10, it's this basic thing. But when you write about, who you're attracted to and why, I find that you can, even as, a lot of us are forced to be varying degrees of beta in our wagey jobs, in our day-to-day lives. It's kind of part of the package of modern urban life. But, if you're sitting in the cafe, you see the girl and you write what you think. And maybe I find, even as a quote-unquote nice guy myself, like sometimes you're even surprised at what comes out of you. Like, wow, I really... I'm looking at her this way, but of course you are, because you're a guy, and that's what you do. So if you're able to tap into that, it can be a way of tapping into a certain vital energy, a certain male gaze, so to speak, that feminists poo-poo on, but I, truly and sincerely believe it is the root of most great art in the West. It's Absolutely. A way of accessing a vital way of looking and vital, sometimes uncomfortable truths about yourself and about your perception. And if you can do that with women, you can start to do it with everything. You can do it with, as we talked about, with the political pipeline, but even just on a literary basis, if you can write the same way about being horny, if you get used to, I think Tacos has even said this, like if you get really good at writing about being horny, if you get really good about writing about coupling up and sex, then when your father passes away, all of a sudden you'll have that access in you to write about that tragedy in a compelling and real way, because you're used to
being honest.
You're used to being honest, and you're used to honestly accessing your emotions and expressing them. And I would humbly submit that in the world of most young men, like the most ready access they have to radical honesty, it has to do a little bit with their libido.
Oh, true.
And I think that is fundamental to the Manosphere to literature pipeline.
Well, this just
and the Manosphere to political pipeline too.
This just occurs to me right now. 1984. They sought, I think, in the novel. Orwell wrote that they sought to eliminate the orgasm because that was the one moment where you weren't controlled by the party, where you were thinking about something that was not like, I love the party. And I think there's uncomfortable parallels to today and wokeness and all this, official propaganda that we have to 100%. Co-sign on. Like, if you're in the cafeteria looking at the girl and you're supposed to think about all the ways you've contributed to her oppression, and you see her, awesome rack, and you're thinking about grabbing it, suddenly you're not thinking about how you're oppressing her.
You're literally, I think, there's some, let's be honest, there's some feminists who are a little bit more reasonable, but there's a lot of, especially this latest wave, who literally don't think it's okay for men to have those thoughts without consent. They might be heterosexual women, and they want men to be men sometimes, but it's like male sexuality can only be sanctioned behind the realm of a signed agreement of consent. It's basically banished. It's basically sexuality, heterosexual male sexuality is basically banished, and I think it's because it is inherently at odds with the kind of woke social communist stuff.
Yeah.
I don't, it sounds like a right-wing conspiracy, but this is kind of become the live reality for a lot of us.
Yeah, basic male sexuality is to, initiate engagement with the woman, shall we say. And that runs into all these layers of did you consent? Did you check the appropriate? And so that runs right into all of the Metoo and the woke shit. And so what literature, gives you is what red pill, writing gives you is the ability to drill down into, this honest way of looking at women and the world, which is totally at odds with the narrative that we're fed. And that, yeah, like you say, Matt, that's a vital energy that you can apply to other things, that you can apply to politics. Is like, like look at Cernovic. He's someone who 6 years ago no one knew who he was. He was just some guy, and now he has like 2 million Twitter followers, and like everyone, he's more famous than all of the journalists who profile him. And, how did he get there? It's just, because he's, a red pill journalist of sorts. I mean, like, I don't know if he'd want to be called a journalist, but, you
of
get
sorts, for sure, yeah.
Get my meaning.
No, I mean, we'll get more into this later, I think, too, but yeah, sexuality, and especially generative, phallic, male sexuality, is the primordial source of all things. And that's why it's important even to ostensibly conservative, which are often seen as anti-sex or historically, but, conservative political goals. It's, this primordial male sexuality is like the generative source of life. It's cum. It's, you get what I'm saying? And that does make it, it makes it politically useful to people who would generate it, who would canal it in the right direction, and it makes it politically dangerous for those who try and suppress it. And that's the story of the Manosphere. It's something that starts as a libidinal urge, how do I get laid, and it ends politically and also literarily.
Absolutely. And I mean, the original emphasis of it's applying the male, we just went through how this is applying the male gaze to art, to politics, but to drill back down to the original application of the male gaze by, say, Heartiste, he applied it to dating. He applied it to, like, how do I use this red pill? And, like, this is, I think this is important for, listeners to realize, and especially younger listeners who, were, maybe not of fucking age in the 2000s, to realize that, like, this is where the Sigma male shit kind of comes from. This is where the, he is what Heartiste in his program is talking about, is how to become a quote-unquote Sigma male, how to game the system of alpha beta to kind of raise your own status and to become highly desirable by bucking the system of, kind of, well, maybe not necessarily buck, but gaming the system, as it were. And gaming the system.
No, 100%. Yeah, no, he teaches you how to go. Well, he usually puts it in terms of how to go from beta to alpha, but we may understand, the sigma, quote unquote, elements of that.
Yeah. I think what's interesting there is the division. Like, his conception of alpha is like, I think that the kind of conception of alpha more traditionally is like the quarterback, the jock that everyone likes, and like, he's kind of teaching you to be more of like, that's like a natural, and I think he has a chapter or a few lines in the book about natural alphas who fail to remain alpha because that fades. And like, he's really, I don't know, maybe you don't agree, but I think he's teaching you to be okay, I sound stupid with all this sickness stuff.
No, go on. No, I actually, to be honest with you, we should keep this in the show. I am not as familiar with the Sigma male meme, but I think there's absolutely a difference between a quote unquote natural alpha, who is just someone who's, often peaked in high school, and then ends up getting married and turning into a beta schlub. There's a big difference between that and this sort of skilled Don Juan, Lothario, Casanova, insert name here.
Exactly.
That Heartiste is trying to train you to be, whether that's as a Sigma male or whatever you want to call it. there is a difference between the trained, someone who has trained themselves to be beyond, to basically not rely on women for anything.
Yeah.
Versus the natural alpha, who's just a kind of a natural physical specimen,
The
ameliorated, but exactly, the high school quarterback. And we all know what happens to a lot of people who peak in high school. They end up turning into schlubs. So
good thing that didn't happen to me.
What, were you the high school quarterback?
No, I say good thing that didn't happen to me.
You're right, of course. But yeah, no. He offers. We won't, on this show we won't even necessarily get that far into the specifics of the content of the book. People should definitely read it for themselves. But he has a wealth of knowledge on pickup, even getting into ultra specific techniques and tactics. A lot of it founded on a fundamental philosophic view of men and women, which he also cites the writer F. Roger Devlin for. Again, a lot of people listening to this probably will be familiar with the basic F. Roger Devlin views about hypergamy and how feminism and capitalism have affected the sexual marketplace, and a lot of people will be comfortable with, not comfortable, but a lot of people will be familiar with the basics of game, so we probably don't need to summarize that stuff too much. We'll assume a degree of foreknowledge, but if you're not familiar with that stuff, then you should definitely read Heartiste and read Devlin.
I was thinking maybe we want to drill down into how effective do we think, or how reasonable do we think his tactics and techniques are for actual dating and relationships
and hooking up. Yeah, it's the $1 million question. I mean, yes, we talk about the pipeline, the Manosphere to literature, Manosphere to politics pipeline, and how this stuff branches out well beyond the realm of pickup artistry. But if it's the question, but fundamentally, and especially in this book we're reading, it's Heartiste on game. The question is this stuff about game and about relationships and women, is it accurate or is it not? And it's the question which later becomes maybe an existential question that you carry with you as you read this book, is, does this stuff work? And I think we both had somewhat interesting experiences, maybe having one impression at first, maybe trying out stuff, or maybe even just thinking it through, and arrived at different conclusions, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah. So, in general, his advice is to be aloof. I mean, this is reductive, but it's be aloof, be withholding, women will chase you. And that is, and also, frankly, probably applies to men as well, and power dynamics in general. Be withholding, aloof, people will assume you're higher value, and just run with that. And that kind of underlies the whole game. And again, we're probably telling you stuff you already know, because, we all know game. We all have heard about this stuff. But he breaks it down on a very granular level. So, examples are and, I was reading through this and we were talking about it, Matt, and we were laughing about it, that, stuff like you shouldn't show your palms when you're trying to pick up a girl. You should only show her the back of your hand. Which is not to say you should slap backhand her, but you should not show your palms to a woman, which just sounds fucking insane. And you should, when you're holding a drink, you should only hold it at waist level, not at chest level. Don't hold it by your nipples, because that's beta. And so that just it sounds, I'm reading, I'm like, this is stupid as shit that I've, but, a week after, we started talking about it, and I was at a party, and I was holding my drink. I was, self-consciously holding it by my waist, because I'm like, well, let me try this out. I felt more alpha. It definitely, and I think it looks more alpha too to hold your drink by your waist than to hold it up by your chest.
It absolutely does. I did the same. I wasn't at a party, but I did the same test in front of a mirror, and I was really struck by the results. And if you actually want to learn game from this book, so my experience of reading it, like it's overwhelming. It's like, how on earth could I apply all this stuff? I'm hopelessly a beta. I would get too self-conscious about all these lines and all these attitudes to strike. But obviously, I would say the best way to read this is by osmosis. You read this stuff, and you remember to be confident and aloof, and a lot of it kicks in. But then on another level, some of that ultra-specific stuff, which we did sort of make fun of and question at first, like with the drink holding rule, I feel like a little thing like that, the opposite of osmosis, it's like it's just honing in on one specific thing, and like maybe once you hold the drink by your waist rather than your chest, all of a sudden you just feel more confident. And that actually is what struck me about it. I felt more confident. It's more of a power pose, so to speak.
Yeah.
So it's twofold. Heartiste is filled with little chunks of wisdom that you can apply very specifically that will then affect, the way that you act, your demeanor, once you do it, it will affect your demeanor going forward. And then also, I think even just reading it and absorbing it, like you don't even have to think about it, because I think that what Heartiste would say too is that like all this game stuff you can't get too self-conscious over. You just gotta like learn to embody it over time.
Yeah, unlocking your confidence, basically.
Exactly.
And so, like, if putting a drink on your head made you feel more confident, Heartiste would probably tell you to do it. Now,
pretty much.
Most people would not feel more confident in that situation, but it's like a lot of his tips and tricks are just to unlock confidence, I feel.
Exactly, and there's a lot of it, and some of it's even lighthearted. Sometimes you can, when you're reading this book, it's funny. It's one of the ways in which Heartiste is a good writer, as he is funny. And some of the time, it's not that. I think a lot of it is very serious. Maybe all of it's 100% serious, but also it's approached with a certain humor. And again, not that I'm necessarily I can't endorse everything Heartiste says in this book about treating women, obviously, but if you're going to give it a try, I would recommend just going into it with a sense of humor, not taking it too seriously, because otherwise, if you get bogged down by the details, you'll say, I can never do this. But I think that if you approach it with the right levity, you may be surprised.
Yeah.
And I think that overall our conclusion, when we were preparing the notes for this, is like, we basically co-sign that Heartiste is largely correct about game.
Yeah.
Though perhaps we do have a couple, angles of criticism. But the basics of game, I think that, who are we to say that this man isn't the king?
Very true. Very true, Matt.
Do you wonder sometimes, like, is Heartiste a bit oversexed? Like, some of his ways of writing and thinking, not to put myself in a power position over him, because he's probably a better writer than me, and obviously he's older, but sometimes it reminds me of like certain things I would write and think when I was a bit younger and frankly hornier than I am now, or like less sexually satisfied because I was single, and sometimes it does feel like he's kind of thinking with his dick a little bit, and I in a way that reminds me a little bit of like certain very perverse thinkers of the left, like Foucault, where it's like everything reduces to sex. I mean, Heartiste as much as says that the only point of being alive is for sex, that every social reality reduces on down to it. It's actually something I semi-satirized, semi-explored in Dragon Day with the character of Wallingford and his, for people who've read the book, his whole philosophy about everything reducing to penis size and penetration, etc. So sometimes I wonder if Heartiste sort of is a bit oversexed and maybe is a little bit blinded to the parameters of life, beyond his dick, so to speak. But then I come right back and wonder, like, is that a bad thing? Like, I don't know, maybe he's right on some level. Like, obviously there is more to life than sex, but
I think
is not there some important social reality and contained totally within sexuality?
I think this harkens back to the distinction between the early 2010s and today's world. And like, yes, he, undoubtedly is oversexed. Heartiste is like way too, even at that during that era, too focused on this to the detriment of the amount of effort you would have to spend to be the Lothario that Heartiste wants you to be is almost exclusive of even having a job. Like this is your job, and that's insane.
Yeah.
Like you do need like just even to support yourself, but beyond that, man's aspirations have to be more than getting laid.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that we right now we live in a time that's politically fraught. That really. I don't think it's trite to say, but I don't think it's wrong to say that great questions, great challenges are, in front of us. Great
Mm-hmm.
forces are on the move, in the words of Churchill. And that wasn't true in the early 2010s.
Yeah.
So this, emphasis on, like, be the best Lothario you can be. I mean, it's almost an autistic, like no one could really follow Heartiste's program to the letter. But also, like, what else were you going to do? You go watch The Hangover?
Yeah.
You're going to, I don't know, like, I don't even know what people did in the 2010s. But
yeah. Go see Modest Mouse or something. But yeah,
today,
no, I get what you're saying.
There's more.
Yeah, there's more to focus on, and no, it comes back down to that, like, he is setting a certain ideal, and maybe it's a semi-dark ideal at times, but it's nevertheless, it's an ideal, it's an extreme vision of the world, and whether it is perfectly applicable in every scenario, I don't know, but there is a purity to even the vision, even in its extremity, and it is something that can influence you by osmosis. It's something to aspire to at times and to, take with certain grains of salt, as we've said.
I think his advice on game is very good, but it's also kind of takes as a presupposition that a couple of things. Like, one, it takes as a presupposition that you are the type of male that this will help. And there are, like, genetically, I think that, confidence and extroversion are somewhat genetic. If you're on the low end of confidence or extroversion and you try this stuff, you probably seem insane. And people will, not like you, I assume. So, like, you need to kind of, like, know your role.
For sure. And I think there's an even more basic point, which it's almost not worth repeating, but we should. It's stuff you'd find on incel black pill forums. Not that I'm a black pillar, but nevertheless, there are some criticisms here. And people say that the PUA scene died because people realized it just really wouldn't work if you were below a 7 or maybe even below a 6. There's genetic limitations pertaining to looks, and also, as you said, pertaining to confidence.
I think less so. I'm very skeptical of the incel black pill because, like, I mean, a lot of like there's so many examples of not very good looking guys who have very hot women.
It's true.
And a lot of, like, I think the apps make it that, you're not going to get the swipe if you're ugly, but in person, it's different because a man's attractiveness is manifested in his, alphaness or personality, right. Not necessarily alphaness, but, like, you can be an attractive guy without being an attractive guy. And
you're right.
Yeah.
Like, take Elliot Rodger, for example.
Yeah.
Like,
good example.
Obviously I've read My Twisted World. Maybe one day we'll do a show if it's not too controversial. But I don't know exactly why he didn't think he could find women. But it didn't have to do with his looks at all. It didn't even really have to do with his lack of confidence per se. It had to do with the fact that he was, extremely neurotic. Probably to be around him, you could tell something was wrong with this guy, which is the case for a lot of, or not even, and it doesn't even have to be that bad. Obviously, some people are just variously neurotic in ways that's going to
interfere
make applying
with attraction.
Most of the, for sure. I mean, like, you kind of made the point. Go on, sorry.
Like Rogers, he was a good looking guy, And yeah, I mean, confidence obviously wasn't exactly his problem, because, what he ultimately did was, you can't really be unconfident and
I
do
guess
something
not.
like
Yeah, yeah,
that.
yeah.
So really, just a fundamental, antisocial affect, inability to
Right.
like connect with people, simmering resentment, obviously. And like, there's no doubt in my mind that people say, oh, he would have, he wasn't really an incel. He could have gotten laid. And I don't think so. I think, women probably hated him because being around him, they're like, this guy is fucking weird. And
Exactly.
he
Yes.
said, he feels like he wants to kill me. And like,
Yeah.
so like, yeah, someone like Rogers, he, he is the proof that Heartiste could have helped him. Or I don't know, maybe he couldn't have helped him. But like, if he knew game, if he, and like, I know we're gonna get a lot of hate for this from like incels and stuff. But if only you learned game, you would, your
Yeah.
life would change. But I mean, I think Heartiste is right to a certain extent that like these techniques will make you attractive if you can use them. Where I think Heartiste was deficient is that not everyone could benefit from Heartiste techniques. That like a more holistic game would be, okay, if you're like the type of guy who could use Heartiste techniques, do that. And if you're not, if you're like, very beta in certain ways, learn how to be like a fun loving beta. And, not as many women will want you, but some will. Like, lean into your strengths, basically.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, you kind of made it, which I thought was a good point, so I don't want to take your point, but I also want to say it and co-sign that you did, in fact, say this. You kind of said that Heartiste is almost not sufficiently biological determinist in parts. He kind of is a blank, and maybe this is just rhetorically good for someone who's trying to build an audience and for someone who's trying to convince you that he can help you, but he's a little bit, he's a total anti-blank slateist when it comes to everything, apparently including race, as we later learned. But when it comes to men, he's almost comes across as a little, not a total blank slateist, because he acknowledges the natural differences between men, but there is, and maybe if Heartiste was on the Zoom, he'd say, I never said that. But it's one reading it, one is like, oh, this anyone can apply aspects of this, and I maybe there are some people who pretty much can't apply any aspect of it.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's a spectrum. Some people, but yeah, exactly. He is addressing men as though they are a blank slate mentally. That every man has the same mental capacities, emotional capacities,
Right.
And so like, in a way, he's being the way that the woke tards are.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah, in a limited capacity.
In a limited capacity, but it's a grain of salt with. I would say there's a number of grains of salt with which to pick up stuff in general.
Yeah.
And this is one of those grains of salt, perhaps. And another point I just wanted to hit is that, because it's funny, but also a little bit relevant to this, is that a lot of what Heartiste recommends, like verbatim, this is cultivating dark triad personality type traits, at least performatively, but honestly it sometimes seems like he actually thinks that you should act like Patrick Bateman, and that's like the best way to get ahead in life. I mean, he literally says, the more narcissistic, selfish, lacking in empathy you are, the better, in parts, and he changes his tone elsewhere. But it's worth noting that is sort of the end game of game, is turning into this, if not Patrick Bateman, and at least Don Draper. I mean, like, very, very, very cold male, which I don't know. I mean, is it worth, maybe it is the best way to produce the most of what Heartiste would call the vagina tingle, perhaps. But, whether or not it's the way you want to comport yourself in life is another question. And for me reading it, and we'll probably touch on this a bit more later, like, just existentially, it's like I'm with this to a point, but I don't necessarily even want to be the ideal alpha that Heartiste describes, because it's a pretty cold reality.
Crucially, like, you know, you mentioned Don Draper. I mean, like, yeah, he's cool, and yeah, he got laid a lot, but do you really want to be Don Draper? If you watch the show, he's a pretty fucked up guy. He, you know, has a lot of sorrow, a lot of like bad shit that winds up happening because he's so fucked up. Like, in general, being a psychopath has certain limitations in your ability to, like, the good. You have to define what the good is. What is it that you want in your life? And, you know, if it's to fuck the most women possible, then yeah, you should be Don Draper. You should be whoever Heartiste is telling you to be. But, you know, there's more to life. I think we think, in general, I think the Manosphere has kind of grown up in a way, in that they acknowledge now, like, generally, like, dissident right, Twitter, dissident right in general, Manosphere, like, whatever this thing became and is right now, it's not about fucking as many women as possible.
No. Pretty much for no one. You know, not for Rouge V, obviously. We'll get on that later. Not even for Tacos, who's still pretty horny. But no, and I'll add even Heartiste, and I'll add this as a defense of him. I think what he would say, and this is, we read the first basic 100 pages of Heartiste on Game for this podcast. I ended up going a bit ahead, getting into his chapters on sex, and actually getting into his chapters on what he calls relationship game. And a softer side later emerges. I think what Heartiste would say is that he himself is a bit of a Lothario. He himself, you know, is like Rouge used to be, you know, get as high a body count as possible. But he says elsewhere, no, I never said that men should do that. I want to give them the tools to be the alpha that can choose whether to use their sexual power to do that or not, or to use it for other things. He says that later, and I'll grant him the point. I think that I'm not 100% sure if I agree with this, but I think it's a compelling point. I think what Heartiste would say is, no, you don't have to have an ultra high body count, but you're going to be a stronger man if you could do that if you wanted.
Absolutely.
And these are the tools so that you can do that if you want. If you want to choose it to be married and have kids, or apply, you know, your erotic energy to any number of other exploits, you can do that. But the more of a pirate, the more of a booty bandit. Sorry to say that shit. Wow, that sounds terrible.
No, that's good.
The more of that you can be, it's basically a level of your fitness as a male, which on an evolutionary level is true and compelling.
Which is appealing to women on an evolutionary level. And that is, I think, a pretty good segue to talk about how this is evidenced in, and how this operates in, sadomasochism and BDSM. And
absolutely, yeah.
You know, this, I don't think Heartiste talked about BDSM or talks about it. He probably thinks it's like some weird shit that, you know, losers still. But, you know, we do it. I don't know. That's, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Matt.
No. We'll approach it this way. Like, I don't think Heartiste ever uses the word BDSM. In his, at least in what we read. And, you know, is that because he's writing in a time when it was still slightly more taboo to talk about it? Perhaps. But he writes about it almost not subliminally. It's like it's part and parcel of what he writes about, in a way where he does it. It's not like a side fetish thing for him. His point is that this is the way that women are. They like an ultra dominant man, and this is the way, you know, alpha males are, at least. They like to dominate women. And he doesn't talk about BDSM, but the name of his blog is from this French novel, The Story of O. The Royce is, I guess, the main character in that. And the Chateau Heartiste is where he lives and fucks.
Is it actually called the Chateau Heartiste?
I think so. I haven't read Story of O, but I'm pretty sure he just took it wholesale. And, you know, that's not BDSM in a German dungeon porn, let me pee in your mouth way, but it is part of that tradition of sadomasochistic literature.
Yeah.
And, again, talking about, like, the sex sections of the book, which I find to be wonderful, frankly. Like it's very good erotica. It's very hot descriptions of sex, and you can imagine, like, when you read that section on sex, you can see it's like something clicked for me, because it's like, oh, this actually is stuff that women like. You know what I'm saying? Like, I can actually imagine a woman really enjoying those descriptions, and I all of a sudden I totally believe that Heartiste is not just fronting, and that women really do enjoy his company, and you can see why. Anyway, I say all this to say that for Heartiste, these kind of dominant sex act, it's part and parcel of his worldview. He doesn't call it BDSM because he didn't have to. For him, it's just sex.
Yeah, exactly. He is suggesting you live as a dom, basically. Exactly. You are a 24/7 dom in reality, in the real world. And so I think that's a bit reductive, but I think that's somewhat reasonable to say. And BDSM is a kind of, in a way, taking this dynamic and delimiting it to the bedroom or to a specific scene or whatever. And so it's a way of kind of embodying this divide, evolutionary, embodying the evolutionary ideals that women will respond to, and doing it in a way that is almost self-consciously acknowledging that the social reality is not supposed to reflect this. And I think you see this
exactly
in the sense that a lot of women in the scene, as it were, are very progressive, and they are feminists and intersectional feminists and all of this stuff, but they still want to be dominated by rough, aggressive men. Now, they can't really get that in reality without feeling shitty about themselves because they got fucked by a Trump voter. So they seek someone who says he's not a Trump voter and fucks them in an aggressive manner in a BDSM scene, and that is it's a way of safely experiencing what has become criminalized or taboo sexuality, which is in fact natural sexuality.
Yeah, no, a few thoughts on that. I mean, it's the role of BDSM and the rising role of the acceptability of BDSM in modern urban culture is fascinating. And I have a nuanced take on it. I think that, some of the people who are into it are totally in denial about what it represents. A lot of people in the Manosphere, I wasn't really around for this, but my impression is with the popularity of 50 Shades of Grey, a lot of people didn't praise the book or anything because it is a horribly written book, but it was the popularity was kind of viewed as a vindication of a lot of what the Manosphere stood for. Yeah. But the role of BDSM in modern urban culture, and again, it is a increasingly socially accepted thing, is fascinating. And I gotta plug your book, Dan, because which is not out, so I don't want to cock tease people too much with it.
It's called Nutcracker.
Nutcracker, as you can imagine, there's a sexual element. There's I remember the scene of the main character Spencer, who is a somewhat bumbling would-be alt-rightist, getting into BDSM and getting into a relationship with a very liberal, progressive submissive woman from a website, and his argument, his view, which is bumbling, but is there a grain of some kind of interesting truth there, views BDSM as like the last bastion of patriarchy and gender roles in the West. And I'm curious to what extent you think that, obviously it's satirical, but how much truth do you think is in that satire? Well, I'll just pose it that way.
I think that, and when I wrote it, I intended that Spencer, the protagonist of Nutcracker, was going into that encounter with his, then date, soon to be girlfriend, and he was thinking, she is deluded in her progressive ideals because she really wants this, rough, red-pilled sex. and that, he was going to, convert her to his worldview based on the appeal and of the sexual appeal of this dynamic. But what he eventually realizes in the novel is that it is a safe way for women like Crystal, the girl in the novel, to experience these things, and that he's the one who actually is subverted because he has to continue to be a part of her world, co-sign on values that he doesn't believe in, and
Right.
he he gets to fuck her. But I mean, he's really delivering to her a dynamic that she needs and wants, but cannot, find in the wild,
Yeah.
because in the wild, she's going to get it from someone who she doesn't want to be in a relationship with.
Yeah.
So BDSM,
She's going to get it with someone who she doesn't want to be in a relationship with, if she can get it at all, because there is also this reality that men are increasingly weak, especially in cities. And I think that, just I'll add as a caveat, I think that is another reason why the popularity is going up. I mean, we're always attracted to what there's a lack of, and I think some of the, inflamed interest of women in BDSM has to do with this, this severe lack of masculinity in society. But no, go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I mean, that's basically it. That, like, she, he is subverted by the process, because he is the one who, ultimately compromises. I mean, that's not how the book ends. The book ends in a very different manner. Mm-hmm. But he, to maintain this relationship, he has to embrace progressive values, and it's
so the moral there, I would say, from my personal life, is that no, being interested in BDSM is not a redeeming quality for ultra progressive women. But I do have to say that women who I've known who are somewhat into BDSM and just somewhat in touch with the fact, basically women that know that they like dominant guys and are not necessarily progressive. Women I've met like that are far preferable to the women who are in denial about the fact that they even like dominant guys at all. Which is, I've dated women like that too, where it's like they're sort of in denial about wanting this alpha type behavior. They think they want the nice romantic sex, and, equality even in the bedroom. So I have found, even though I'm not saying like go find yourself a girl who's into that, because most of them are, even more progressive than average, I do think it's a basic sign of well-adjustment if a woman is willing to, if a woman's more in touch with the fact that she does like a dominant guy, and if a woman can tell you that, especially, and again, I could call myself a beta male. I won't, because I don't, I think half of being alpha is wanting to be, so I won't call myself a beta male. But I do think that living in a city, living this modern wagey lifestyle, it's pretty hard to live out, Heartiste alpha status. So it can be helpful. Again, we're not talking about German dungeon porn, but it can be helpful when you meet a girl who's like way more just like, this is what I like. And it can be rather liberating for you as a male scared of Metoo and all that to just be able to lean into that with someone. So no, I don't think BDSM is the last bastion of patriarchy in the West, but I think a touch of it can have redemptive qualities and can be a positive path for some couples.
Absolutely. I mean, anything that results in really good sex, that's good. That's a good in the world. You mentioned that in cities men are cucked, and it's pretty abysmal. And I think what's interesting about that, and this brings us to another topic here, is that is a more, not entirely a recent phenomenon, but its hyperization is a recent phenomenon. And when Heartiste was writing in the early 2010s, men were not as cucked because it was before all this woke stuff kind of took off in like 2015.
Right. Yeah.
And so that introduces a couple of interesting questions. But one question is, to what extent is pickup and game able to coexist with the Me Too movement? And
it's a great question, because on the one hand, the Heartistes of the world, the PUAs, would say, what are we, scared of Me Too? You know what I'm saying? Like, no, obviously the alpha attitude is like, who cares? Women are hysterical. They're in denial. We don't care. We're going to keep doing it. But when it's pushed past a certain point, as it has been, where people's livelihoods literally become in danger, because they went on a bad date, and just, of course, we have to add the caveat, this isn't all of Me Too. We're not defending Harvey Weinstein, especially because Rose McGowan has been kind of based recently. So I'm not dismissing everything of Me Too, but I don't think it's controversial to say the way that it's devolved, with the Aziz Ansari of it all, and just the way that it's made men in general at all levels of society, not just powerful men, but men at all levels of society, afraid to approach women. Well, yeah, that's a beta attitude. We should still apply PUA stuff, but it does get harder, because when Heartiste was writing this stuff in 2010, there was a reasonable assumption that there was a separation of your relationship and sex life. There's a total separation between that and your professional life. I mean, if you bring it too much into the workplace, if you shit too much where you eat, that's going to sow chaos. But there was a reasonable assumption that what you did at bars on the weekend and with women on dating apps wasn't going to affect your, reputation and work life. But I would say that we're kind of out of that realm, and now there is this great fear of the way you can be tarnished online and the reputation that can end up preceding you.
Well, now we live in the total state, the total internet state, where the web is social media is so pervasive that you can get canceled for stuff that, is just, totally unrelated to your job. And you can become a celebrity even though you're not a celebrity. And that is, that's a game killer.
It is, yeah.
I mean, there are real, an example, I remember I had a friend in my early 20s who followed there's a pickup artist, I think, who called himself Tyler Durden. And he had, something, or maybe it's a different pickup, I don't know. But in any case, my friend was following this Kiss Open. So you go up to women, and to open them as a potential dating partner, you just start kissing them. And this, he actually didn't get beat up that I know of. I don't know how effective it was, to tell you the truth, but, he didn't, nothing really bad happened to him. I think if this happened today, bad stuff is much more likely to happen to you.
Yeah, people video you're on TikTok, whatever,
exactly.
On YouTube. Yeah.
I mean, and with, being punched in the face at the low end of the bad stuff. The really bad stuff would be, you're on TikTok and you lose your job and become an internet meme. And so whenever anyone Googles you, you're the weird, PUA rapist guy, and you never get hired again. And
right,
so
no, and yeah.
That's, that whole, yes, Kiss Opens probably should be, killed. That's, that's a game that's
probably
really,
was never a good,
it's not a good game technique. But, other game techniques are, they're not, they can't live in harmony with this.
And I think what the supreme alpha, what the supreme gentleman would say would be that, if your game is really on point, you'll circumvent all of this because no woman will complain about you because you're so wonderful. But also Heartiste and Roosh and the others would be the first to say that in order to get to that place, you're going to have to fail a lot. You're going to have to practice and fail a lot. And I think it's that time for people to practice and fail where the stakes have been substantially raised. even avoiding the whole like potential social media blitz of it, like just the way women are liable to react to you. You know, maybe in 2010, 2011 to be like, oh, you're a loser, go away. But now it's like, oh, you're one of those people that I've been told is like the root of all evil in society. It just, you know, and
exactly.
maybe you can withstand that if you're, you know, you can try to adapt, but it's the stakes are raised.
The Schmidt of it all.
The what?
The Schmidt of it all.
Who's Schmidt?
Carl Schmidt, the friend.
Oh. Yeah, of course. Yes, no, that's a really good point that we actually hadn't even talked about for the outline. But yeah,
that's an episode
it's
title.
Much more. It is.
I mean, not this episode, the Manosphere to Literature Pipeline is a great title, but the Schmidt of it all, we gotta use that for a title at some point.
We do, but the friend-enemy thing, that's key, because it started with, and I don't blame Trump, but even before Metoo, it was the rise of Trump all of a sudden turned all of these things. So part of what we're trying to say is that, you know, Heartiste was writing from a time when you could kind of just be like this casual, chill, middle to upper middle class white guy enjoying life in this Obama era, you know, hangover, the hangover type humor era. That's probably the reason why the Heartiste of 2010, obviously we know that Heartiste has politics now, as we addressed, but the Heartiste of 2010 was very dismissive of politics. He's like, don't worry about politics, you know, maybe have some fun telling, he says Bush, you know, maybe have some fun telling a girl that you voted for Bush or whatever, but like, he's basically apolitical, because the time he was writing was relatively apolitical, and sex was more interesting than politics. But post-Trump, this friend-enemy distinction does get introduced, and all of a sudden, it's no longer, oh, that guy's a douche. It's, oh, that guy is, you know, one of these, like, vampiric, secret, racist Nazi people who's, you know, raping women. Like, the stakes, even if not with, even avoiding the issue of will you or will you not face real material consequences, because, most guys going to a bar on a Friday night aren't going to end up facing that many material consequences, but even just the emotional significance of all of a sudden, you know, you are singled out as like a capital E evil person, due to that friend-enemy distinction post-Trump is very much in the water. Now, and it raises the question, you know, what is the current state of pickup artistry? I mean, it's kind of dead as a blogging movement. You don't really see many people writing about it now, or the people that are kind of more hucksters, you know, they're not purveyors of truth so much. So it's like,
I mean, I think people just aren't getting laid. And I think like as you're talking about it, I'm thinking of the cycle of regimes, the hard times make strong men thing. I think we're now in the kind of the hard times section.
I think so too.
And so like fucking is kind of like, you know, okay, we're not getting laid, but you know, there's actually a lot of worse stuff that's happening. So, you know, we're not as worried about that, but it still sucks. It's like, you know, but it's just like, So, I mean,
no, I get what you're saying. We're living, you know, Tacos has said we're living in the age of pussy warlords or something. It's really a desert out there.
The pussy warlords thing is a really good metaphor, because that describes the pickup strategy that Tacos endorsed on Caribbean Rhythms with BAP, which is game pickup now is game plus fame, and so like that's like, well, what's game plus fame? It's like you want to get laid. Become a warlord. Become an edgelord. You have to have some
notoriety.
Make
which is why
millions of dollars. You know, you gotta have some fucking angle.
Some angle, even if it's for something ostensibly bad. I mean, you know, obviously serial killers get, you know, panties mailed to them, and that's why I think I don't want to speak for him, but I believe Tacos also said on the episode, like, he's really started to integrate like giving women copies of his book and just doxing himself to them as like part of his pickup strategy or something, because women love an online villain, which maybe that could be an aspiration for us with this podcast, is, you know, achieving fame plus game.
That's my long play, Matt. I want to find a wife through this podcast.
you probably will. Watch it happen.
That brings us to an interesting project from someone else, I think.
What's that? Oh, yeah. We should talk about
Fame plus game. Well, who is doing Fame plus game right now? None other than the dark warlord himself, Curtis Yarvin.
The dark prince of the internet, yeah.
He wrote a post on Grey Mirror. I think it's on Grey Mirror.
Yeah, it is.
His blog, asking, or rather an offer to be his girlfriend, and he explains what he's looking for, and his selection criteria, and his what he brings to the table. And he's caught a lot of hate for this, because, or not hate, but
a lot of ridicule. A lot of people basically accusing him of being beta or cringe.
Yeah,
is the main criticism. Yeah,
and I think Heartiste, of course, would say this is the most beta shit I've ever heard of. But I think getting back to what we said earlier, there's a lot of ways to more than one way to skin the cat, and this is a great example of, in my opinion, of someone leaning into his strengths. So Yarvin, what does he have besides a lot of money? I mean, that's a strength, obviously, but it's hard to, convert money into pussy. It's like, unless you have a shit ton, and actually maybe Yarvin does have a shit ton of it, but if you're just like a normal guy and you're making 300, 500,000 a year, it's not like women are lining up. It's not, it's hard to signal that. It's hard to, but what does he actually have? He has a huge internet audience of people who think, rightly so, that he's a really interesting thought leader. And so he's leveraging his audience to reach the people who know him, and he assumes that some of these people are attractive women that he wants to, marry. Again, his wife recently passed away, and he's looking for a new wife. And it's he's using...
What the hell is Yarvin supposed? He's supposed to go out to a bar and neg? No, I don't know. It's like we talked about earlier about certain people are just not neurologically cut out for that, but also when you hit a certain age, you got to play to your strengths. And I think, I wish Yarvin the best of luck. I mean, I think that he runs the risk of attracting some possibly mentally ill women with, because a lot of mentally ill women read NRX.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I should get into that, but because I don't want to, insult any potential female fans. But, there's certain risks. But basically, I think he's doing a very sensible thing. And the guy, I think he lives in San Francisco still, right?
I think so.
So that's not a place to try and do any of this. I mean, that LA is bad. San Francisco is probably worse in terms of trying to date. So I think it's absolutely reasonable to, the same way that a lot of us have taken to finding friends essentially online. Why not? So I wish Yarvin the best of luck with that. It was kind of funny because when even before he put the ad out, he had started writing a few Grey Mirror posts about dating. And it was right when I first started reading this Heartiste book, so it's kind of fascinating to read them back to back. And I mean, I was struck I'm a little bit more like Yarvin than I am
Yarvin
Heartiste.
Joins the Manosphere.
Yeah. No, the way he thinks about relationships, and there's different angles, which maybe that leads to another point, which is that I think that Heartiste is a certain kind of genius, and there's a lot of brilliance in this, but overall I think that he is mostly just talking about a certain ideal of alphaness, which can be very, very effective, the same way that someone like Bap describes a certain ideal of being a Greek god on earth, or Mike Ma, in our last episode he describes this way of being in the world, however you describe it, but it's some kind of exhaustive ideal. In Ma's case, it involves hyper-specific dietary restrictions, but neither here nor there. I view Heartiste that way. He's someone who's laying out an ideal that can be aspired to sometimes, that you can absorb certain things by osmosis from reading about. But overall, at the end of the day, a lot of us are going to be more like Yarvin with his blog posts. Where
hopefully,
high IQ,
ideally,
ideally, yeah.
If you have Yarvin's, pull, but I mean, a lot of people, it's a sad state of affairs. You can't game, And if you're not Yarvin, like, yeah, you put out a blog post and no one reads, that's not going to work. So I hate
No,
to
yeah, I don't mean to
introduce
put
a
down
black
Yarvin.
pill,
Yeah.
but
I just mean that Yarvin. What am I trying to say? I think that his strategy will be effective.
oh yeah,
It's just that it's not super overtly alpha. It's something much more pragmatic.
yeah,
And I guess that's part of what I'm saying. All of us at some point may, and again, in the relationship chapter, which I've just gotten to in the book, there is a softer side of Heartiste's vision that comes out in his chapter on what he calls relationship game or long-term relationship game. When you're reading the book earlier, you very much get the sense that that Heartiste is almost against long-term relationships. He is actually against marriage, but nevertheless, he's and you get the impression that the only thing he views as suitable is being this Tony Soprano / Don Draper type who, even if they're in a marriage or a long-term relationship, has tons of mistresses. And to an extent, I think that is what Heartiste recommends. But once you get into his section on long-term relationships, you realize that he actually does have very good advice for those as well. And there's a place in his worldview for people who are married, for people with kids, for people in long-term relationships. It's a little bit like that chapter we talked about in Mike Ma, where he talks about the beauty of women not on birth control. It's a similar vibe to that, where it's like a softer side comes out. And you realize that, similar with his sections on sex as well, you realize that he's more than just a woman hater, and that there is very life-giving, nourishing side to this advice.
yeah.
That's a bit of a tangent.
Well,
but
I don't think
basically,
it is a tangent. I think it actually introduces one of our principal takeaways from this, which is that he, in a sense, Heartiste is teaching conservative men who are more traditional and tend to hold women on pedestals, and maybe that's not the state in the conservative world today, but it was maybe more like 10 years ago. And he's teaching them to be more
more realistic swallow the hard truth pills. It's like both conservative men and liberal men. Again, maybe average conservative man is more red pilled now, but in the context of like 2011, 2012, it's like both sides needed to swallow more truth pills.
Yeah.
Liberals needed to be oriented towards, something higher that conservatives have, so to speak. But a lot of conservative men had their own, and still do have their own kind of blindness and pedestalizing of women.
And they need to be oriented towards something lower, toward the baseness of women and men, the baseness of sexuality, the degradation of the world. And if you can, and I think this is to an extent the value that Heartiste is bringing to relationships and to men in the world, is build a familiarity with degradation. Build a familiarity with licentiousness. And then, in the manner of Jordan Peterson saying that you can't be a good man until you are first able to be a monster. You can't be a good husband until you are first able to be a Lothario. To be... Yeah. And,
which is it's almost like a cruel point that, you have to be able to be something else. To be, it is exactly that Jordan Peterson point.
Yeah.
And it's also exactly the point that Bronze Age Pervert makes in the end of Bronze Age Mindset, which is that, we have to familiarize ourselves with the underworld, with the filth of the underworld, in order to bring about something new. And the image, again, it's semen. It's the sloppy. This is fucking gross. It's the mess of that. But that is the root of all life. It's that dynamic we were talking about earlier. Yeah. It's the primordial energy is neither bad nor good. It's primordial energy is neither oriented. Primordial energy is not inherently oriented towards greatness. And in and of itself, that primordial energy has a Dionysian or chthonic reality to it that can actually, is part and parcel of the filth of the world. But if you can be in touch with that and master it and master that power, you can use it to ascend and to be oriented towards greatness. And I think that is the fundamental contribution of people like Heartiste to the quote-unquote right-wing or conservative movement, which they are associated with, and where people like Ma and Bap, who have an upward-lifting vision, they come from that tradition as well. And to me, this is the no bullshit contribution of, frog Twitter, whatever you want to call it, to the current state of culture, is what Heartiste describes in one of the most memorable passages in the early section of the book, which is called "Why Do Conservatives Pedestalize Women?" And he describes how he describes how a lot of conservative men sort of come from extant families, with parents who are still together, and therefore have this like pedestalized view of women, which you still see from a lot of conservatives like the Drehers, the Vermeules of the world. Bat makes fun of them. And then he describes how liberal democratic men are more likely, they're cucked in so many ways and they have no great vision, but maybe they're from a broken home. Maybe their mothers, he puts it crassly, but it's like maybe they had a mother with a revolving door, and they have this better sense for, the nature of women. If I had to guess, I would say that Heartiste is probably from a family of divorce, but I won't even speculate upon that.
Yeah.
And his message in this section, and he uses a metaphor, which I will state in a moment, why do conservative men pedestalize women from this book, is that he wants to bring the hand of liberal men familiar with the degradation and filth of the world towards the crotch of conservatives oriented towards order and beauty and greatness. And I think that's what Heartiste's contribution ended up being. I think that he found a lot of men who have, what you'd call conservative or right-wing values, and he said, look, you're going to have to swallow these hard pills. We're no longer conserving some 1950s reality where, you can preserve the chastity of the women in your life. Like, that fight is over. It ended 60s, 70s, 80s, whatever. And, that fight is over. There's nothing to conserve. What we have to do is build something new. And in order to build something new, we're going to have to tap into that primordial, messy energy. And, that's the starting point of all things. And I think that was what was picked up by people like Bap and people like Ma. And that is how you differentiate someone who's like a really good poster or contributor to the scene from someone who has less value. I'll just go for it. I don't want to dunk on this person too hard, but I will nevertheless go for it. Like, that's why Nick Fuentes to me is not that interesting, because basically he's just, he's based, but he's basically an older type of conservative. He started like a Buchananist youth, so to speak, with America First, and that's they've Groyper Wars. There's some good stuff there, but it doesn't get to the fundamental heart of what was very magical and effective about the original Trump movement. And you can look at the difference between an older, branch of social conservatism and the kind of new emergent right, more based right wing as, the answer to the following litmus test. I mean, it's statistically shown that everyone from teenagers to young adults to probably even people within marriages are having a lot less sex than they used to. And it's a bit of a litmus test. If you think that that is a good thing, it shows that you're kind of part of the old union between a certain stuffy kind of social conservative and a certain kind of anti-sex feminist. But if you're like me, and I'm sure like you, and obviously like Heartiste and Bap and all the rest, and you recognize that the reduction in the degree to which people, even people who maybe they shouldn't be having sex, like teenagers, at the same time, it's fundamentally a sign of life that it does happen. So the fact that that is going down really tells you something
The reduction
rather
in sex, I'm definitely not in favor of. This is not a good development.
No, it's a sign of the waning health and power of the West. So even though, yes, underage, or I shouldn't, underage is a bad word
We'll
to use in this context.
We'll scrub that.
But of course, even though people having sex out of wedlock obviously has potential negative outcomes, it is nevertheless a bad thing when we see sex rates go down, especially when it's along with marriage rates, which are obviously in the toilet. And I mean, this is a very bad thing, and it's a bit of a litmus test, like whether you think that it's a good or a bad thing that people are fucking less. I don't want to mischaracterize what the Rod Drehers, what the Ben Shapiros of the world would say. I don't necessarily think they would think it was a good thing that people have less sex in this day and age. But I do think some of those conservative thinkers, Ben Shapiro's of the world, Rod Drehers, trad caths in general. You could even look at Roosh V's recent turn a little bit as being a little bit like this.
Even a lot.
It's not.
Like it.
Yeah. It's not so much that they're not necessarily saying that it's a good thing that sex rates are going down, but it is the emphasis is very much on the sort of Benedictine option of it all, the sort of retreat back to your own communities, be them Orthodox Christian or Jewish communities or what, like very much a sense of like, look, the broader society is going to shit, the relationship between the genders is going to shit, but at least we can have our little enclave of orthodoxy,
retreat, a Benedict option, if you will.
Yeah, I guess you could say, because it's a beta option. Because it is sort of, there is a beta element to it. You could look at it that way. It's a way of
it's not
engaging
alpha.
less. Yeah, it's a retreat, and it's a way of engaging less with the broader cultural battle, so to speak. But what people like Heartiste kind of represent in this, again, with this metaphor of bringing the hand of degraded liberalism toward the crotch of order and beauty-oriented conservatism, that you could view that hybrid as a way of being engaged on the broader kind of cultural battlefield.
Exactly.
So sort of like what we talked about with Ma as well, and the accelerationism of it all. It's really being willing to get dirty and get in the fray of it, as opposed to the simple retreat.
Yeah, it's leaning into the chaos as opposed to running away from the chaos.
Exactly. In terms of on the point about degradation, a familiarity with the filth of the world, but also oriented towards something higher, there is a corollary, not corollary, but like an analogy or something related to this in literature, which is the relationship between the Marquis de Sade and his writing and Romanticism, where you have Romanticism as obviously an orientation towards beauty and grandeur, but de Sade is sort of a post-romantic, a romantic in decay, so to speak, and he writes about filth and degradation, obviously, and needless to even say, sadism. So there's, in terms of this notion of bringing the hand of degraded liberalism towards the crotch of greatness-oriented conservatism, the literary dynamic there is the one that's at play between Romanticism and de Sade, that people like Camille Paglia write about. These things, the exaltation of beauty on the one hand and the reveling in filth on depravity on the other, they're two sides of the same coin. They're apparent opposites, but they are part of the same continuum. And the decay that one can trace from Rousseau, who's kind of not a romanticist in a literary sense, but a romantic philosopher, to de Sade, gives us an insight into human nature as this play between reveling in filth, but on the one hand, and being oriented towards beauty on the other. And in that sex section I keep referencing that Heartiste writes about it's a section called "The Most Exciting Sex." He describes how he's only able to look at women as either angels on earth or dirty sluts that he wants to go down to the pit of sin with, and that sort of shows kind of shows Heartiste's cards a little bit as this sort of Sadian figure. And yeah, again, anyone with the book should do themselves a favor and read his descriptions of what he calls sex positions, which are actually basically ideas for creating very strange sexual scenarios. And I just say that to illustrate, I guess, the more literary side of what Heartiste is saying here.
And I think the literary figures of today, you really can't ignore the degraded side of life. That in order to be a good, and I mean this applies beyond literature, this applies beyond game. It's in order to be a good husband, in order to be a good writer, in order to be a good politician, even you have to have a knowledge of the degraded aspects of life and integrate it into the greatness of your vision. And a vision of greatness that ignores the degraded will be overcome by the degraded.
It's a faulty foundation. Yeah.
You need to mix some of that mud into your, foundation. And,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's why we love Tacos' writing, because it mixes in, sex and degraded sex into visions of greatness, visions of love, and compassion, and that makes the greatness greater. Heartiste, in some sense, in that passage you cite, is one of the progenitors of the Red-Brown Alliance, if you will, because he is talking about bringing conservative men to the liberal or the crotch, the fucking metaphor.
Yeah.
And afterwards, going out to the bar to slay and to get laid.
Yeah.
And who were doing it? Conservative men and liberal men together, united by their natures. So he, in a weird way, and I don't think it was his intent at the time. He probably, was in a different era. It was before this, but it prefigures a recognition of the fact that we have certain universal desires, regardless of what side of the spectrum you're on, the political spectrum, and eventually the spectrum it's changing. It's not red, left, right, red, brown so much anymore. It's pretty soon one day it's gonna be based in cringe. It's gonna be red-pilled and blue-pilled, and we're approaching a red-pilled, blue-pilled America, and I think that's maybe a good note to end on, Matt.
Yeah, no, pretty much.
We're approaching a unique political realignment between the based and the cringe, and we're very happy at You Right to be representing, if we do say so, the based, and giving the based a platform to express themselves. And we have some great guests lined up who are going to do that. Surprises. But surprises who you will know, and you'll be like, oh wow, I really wanted to hear what that guy had to say, and you're gonna hear from a lot of people through us.
Yeah, we've run an episode in. We're already getting requests to be on the show, and we're scheduling out through October, November. So, very excited for what's ahead.
Yeah, Yarvin, come on the show
for sure.